It began like any other taping day until everything stopped. The lights gleamed soft gold across the Family Feud stage, laughter echoed through the room, and Steve Harvey stood in his familiar spot, a cue card in one hand and that knowing smile in the other. It was a rhythm he'd lived 1,000 times before the jokes, the quick answers, the roar of the crowd. But that day, something unexpected would break through the laughter, something no one in the studio could prepare for. The question on the board was simple enough. Name something you might hear at home that makes you feel safe. The contestants buzzed in, shouting answers. The TV. The dog barking. Mom's voice. The crowd laughed, clapped, and cheered, just as they always did. Steve played along, teasing, grinning, letting the energy roll. But then it was the widow's turn. Her name was Elaine Carter, a woman in her early 50s, dressed in quiet colors, the kind of person who smiled politely but carried a weight behind her eyes. She stood on the end of her team's podium, her hands clasped, her wedding ring catching the light. When Steve turned to her, something in his expression softened. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, or maybe it was the stillness that surrounded her even in all that noise. "All right, Miss Elaine," he said warmly. "Name something you might hear at home that makes you feel safe." She took a breath, then another. The studio seemed to slow with her. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled just enough for everyone to notice. She said, "My husband's voice." The words were gentle, almost a whisper, but they carried like a thunderclap. The crowd went silent. It was as if the entire room had exhaled at once. Steve blinked, taken off guard. "Your husband's voice," he repeated softly, his tone changing. "Yes, sir," she said, her hands trembling slightly. "He passed away last year. But even now, sometimes at night, I swear I still hear him telling me it's okay, telling me I'm safe." A hush rippled through the studio. The lights that once felt bright and sharp now felt tender, like candlelight. The energy shifted, no longer a show, but a moment suspended in something sacred. Steve lowered his cue card slowly. His face changed, not in that exaggerated way audiences expect, but in something more human, more vulnerable. I'm so sorry," he said quietly. Elaine smiled faintly. "Don't be. He was a good man, a loving man. I just missed the sound of him." The crowd didn't know what to do. Some covered their mouths, others bowed their heads. The sound booth cut the background music. All you could hear was the soft hum of the lights and a few muffled sniffles from the front row. Steve took a small step closer, as though words alone weren't enough. "You know," he said gently, "some people believe the voice of someone you love never really goes away. It stays here." He tapped his chest. "And here." He gestured toward the ceiling. Elaine nodded, tears brimming. "I think that's true," she whispered, "because sometimes I wake up, and I can still hear him laughing in the kitchen. I know it's not really there, but it feels real. It feels like home." Steve couldn't speak for a moment. His eyes glistened under the stage lights, and the crowd could feel it. This was no longer television. It was life. He finally cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "That's the kind of love people spend their whole lives praying to find." The audience broke into quiet applause, not loud or dramatic, just the kind that says, "We see you." Elaine smiled softly, her tears catching the light like tiny diamonds. Steve exhaled deeply, looking toward the scoreboard, then back to her. "Well," he said gently, "I don't think there's a better answer than that." But before he could move on, something unexpected happened. From the corner of the set, one of the producers raised a hand, a signal. Steve frowned slightly. The producer stepped closer, whispering something quickly into his earpiece. Steve's eyes widened for just a second. Then he nodded slowly, looking back at Elaine. "Miss Elaine," he said carefully, "I need you to stay right where you are for a moment." She looked puzzled, but nodded. The lights dimmed slightly. The audience shifted in their seats, unsure of what was happening. Then, from the studio speakers, softly, almost imperceptibly at first, came a recording. A man's voice, low, warm, familiar. "Elaine, if you're hearing this, I just want you to know, I love you, always." Gasps echoed through the room. Elaine froze, her hands flying to her mouth. Her knees wobbled, and Steve instinctively stepped closer, reaching to steady her. The voice continued, shaky but filled with love. "You told me once that my voice made you feel safe. So, I want you to remember that. Every time you hear me, even if it's just in your heart, it's real. I'm still here, baby. I'm right here." By now, tears streamed down her face. Steve's eyes were glassy, his mouth trembling as he whispered, "Lord, have mercy." The audience stood. Some sobbed openly. Others clasped hands, as though prayer was the only right response. Elaine looked up toward the lights, whispering, "That's him. That's really him." And for the first time in all his years of television, Steve Harvey couldn't speak. He simply bowed his head, tears slipping silently down his face, while the sound of love, a man's voice, steady and eternal, echoed across the studio. The studio air had changed heavy with silence, yet fragile, like something divine was resting there. The sound of the man's voice still seemed to linger in the lights, in the rafters, in the quiet breaths of every person in the audience. Even after the recording faded, no one moved. Steve Harvey stood beside Elaine Carter, his hand still resting lightly on her shoulder, as if to keep her steady in a moment that defied gravity. Elaine's tears shimmered beneath the stage lights. Her lips trembled, caught somewhere between a sob and a smile. "That was him," she whispered. "That was my David." Steve blinked, still processing, his cue cards forgotten on the floor. How did that?" he started to ask, then stopped himself, shaking his head softly. Some questions don't need answers. Some are meant to remain holy. A soft murmur spread through the audience, but no one spoke above a whisper. A few people reached for tissues. Others just sat frozen, eyes glistening, hearts wide open. Elaine's daughter, seated in the front row, pressed her hands to her mouth. "That's Dad," she whispered. "That's really his voice." The show's producer stepped onto the stage, hesitant, her expression full of tenderness. She leaned toward Steve and spoke quietly. "Her daughter sent us the recording. Said her father made it before he passed a message to his wife. We planned to play it after her round, as a surprise tribute." Steve's eyes filled again, his chest rising with a deep, trembling breath. "Well," he said, voice breaking, "you sure surprised us all?" The producer slipped back off stage. Steve turned to Elaine. "Ma'am, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that in all my years of doing this." Elaine nodded faintly, brushing away a tear. "He always had a way of showing up when I least expect him." She looked up, her voice softer now. "David used to tell me that love never dies. I didn't believe it until today." Steve smiled gently, the kind of smile that carries both sorrow and awe. "Maybe he's right," he said. "Maybe love just changes where it lives." A soft murmur of agreement rose from the crowd. The camera operators were filming, but even they seemed reverent, framing every shot slowly, carefully, as though afraid to break the spell. Elaine glanced around the room, still trembling. "He was a radio man, you know," she said, her voice finding strength again. "Worked nights. People used to tell me they'd fall asleep to his voice, said it made them feel safe." Steve nodded, listening with that quiet empathy that seemed to reach right through the noise of the world. "And now he's still doing that," he said, "still making people feel safe." Her daughter stepped up to the edge of the stage, clutching something in her hands, a small, old-fashioned tape recorder. "He made this for her," she said softly. "Before he got too sick to talk for long, he wanted Mom to have his voice for the days she missed him most." Steve's gaze dropped to the recorder. It looked ordinary, a simple, silver device, but in that moment, it might as well have been a relic. "That right there," he said quietly, "is love made into sound." He knelt slightly, taking the recorder from the daughter's hands, holding it with reverence. "Your father must have been a special man." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He was everything." Steve turned back to Elaine. "I don't think I'm supposed to keep hosting right now," he said softly, a shaky laugh escaping him. "I think we're supposed to just be still." The crowd responded with gentle applause, not for performance, but for presence. Steve stepped aside, motioning for Elaine and her daughter to join him center stage. The lights above dimmed to a warmer gold, washing the set in the kind of glow that made everything feel softer, like a sunset that didn't want to end. Elaine held the tape recorder close to her chest. "You know what's funny?" she said. "The last thing he ever told me was that he'd find a way to make me smile again." Steve swallowed hard. Looks like he kept his word. The audience smiled through tears, and even Steve's voice began to shake. "I've seen a lot of miracles in my life," he said, "but that right there might be one of the most beautiful." Elaine's daughter wiped her eyes. "When he was sick," she said, "he used to talk about this show. Said it made him laugh even on the days he couldn't get out of bed. He wanted us to come here after he was gone, to thank you for giving him something to smile about." Steve's expression broke completely, the mask of the entertainer gone. The man beneath laid bare. "Lord," he whispered, voice thick, "you never know who's watching, or how what you do might touch somebody." He turned toward the camera, speaking to the audience at home now, his voice trembling but sure. "You know, folks, every day, you've got a chance to lift somebody up. You might think what you're doing doesn't matter, but it does. Even a laugh, even a smile, that might be the thing that carries somebody through their hardest night." Elaine reached out, taking his hand. "Thank you," she said softly. Steve looked down at their hands, then back up at her. "No, ma'am," he said. "Thank you for reminding us all what love sounds like." The audience stood, one by one. Applause rose, slowly, tender, respectful, human. And beneath it, there was something else too. A quiet hum, the echo of a man's voice that seemed to linger in the stillness. Steve tilted his head slightly, as if listening. Then he smiled. "You hear that?" he said quietly. "I think he's still talking to you." Elaine nodded through tears. "I know," she whispered. "I always will." The lights glowed brighter for just a moment, catching the sheen of tears on every face in the room. And in that instant, it didn't feel like a show anymore. It felt like a message sent from somewhere beyond, reminding everyone there that the bonds of love never truly break. The applause faded, but no one sat down. It wasn't out of courtesy. It was reverence. Every person in that room knew they had witnessed something unexplainable, something that reached beyond the stage lights, beyond the television screens, into a place the human heart rarely lets the world see. Elaine Carter stood in the center of the stage, holding the tape recorder close, as if she could still feel her husband's warmth through it. Her daughter stayed by her side, tears streaking her face, yet her eyes carried something more than sadness, peace. Steve Harvey, meanwhile, remained near them both, silent for a long moment, his head bowed, his microphone lowered against his chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost trembling. "You know," he said, "I've done this show a long time. I've seen joy, I've seen family, I've seen laughter that'll make your ribs hurt. But I've never seen love walk into a room and fill it the way it just did." The crowd nodded, a few wiping their faces. Steve took a step closer to Elaine, his tone still hushed. "You said your husband was a radio man?" She nodded, smiling through her tears. "Yes, sir. He worked at WSBM in Birmingham. He used to say voices carry more than words, said they carry the spirit behind them." Steve smiled faintly. He wasn't wrong. He looked toward the ceiling lights, then back to her. That voice of his, the one that came through those speakers, that wasn't just a recording, that was a gift, and I think he meant for all of us to hear it. Elaine clutched the recorder tighter. "He always believed that if you speak love, it keeps living, even after you're gone." Her daughter nodded beside her. "He said sound never really disappears, it just travels." Steve blinked, and you could see something shift in him. The comedian's warmth was still there, but now layered with something older, deeper, the kind of understanding that only comes from loss. "Maybe that's what heaven is," he said quietly. "All the love we ever spoke still traveling." The studio was utterly still. Even the cameras seemed to move slower, like they, too, understood they were capturing something sacred. Then Steve did something no one expected. He turned to the crew and said, "Can we play that again?" A few stagehands hesitated, but he nodded firmly. "Please, play it again." The room went dark, except for a single spotlight on Elaine. The producer hit play. "Once more, That voice filled the air, low, warm, patient. "Elaine, if you're hearing this, I love you. Always. I'm still here, baby." The sound wrapped around the room, tender and steady, like sunlight through stained glass. Steve stood back, his eyes shining. The audience didn't breathe. When the voice faded, Steve whispered, "You hear that? That's love echoing." Elaine pressed the recorder to her chest. "It feels like he's right here," she said softly. "Like he's standing behind me, smiling." Steve nodded. "He is. You know why? Because love like that don't leave the room. It just moves into the air we breathe." The audience erupted not in loud applause, but in gentle, grateful clapping. The kind that comes when a room full of people realizes they've just been part of something holy. Steve's eyes moved slowly across the crowd. He could see people holding hands, hugging, leaning on each other. Some bowed their heads in prayer. Others just stared, lost in thought, lost in memory. He turned back to Elaine and her daughter. "You know," he said, "some people come on this show and walk away with money. Others walk away with memories. But y'all," his voice cracked slightly, "y'all just gave us a miracle." Elaine's daughter smiled faintly. "He would have loved that you called it that." Steve chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I didn't call it that. It was that." He glanced toward the audience again, his voice deepening. "Let me tell y'all something. Every person sitting here, every person watching at home, you've got somebody who loved you so much, heaven couldn't keep quiet about it. That's what we just heard. That's what love sounds like when it refuses to die." Tears shimmered across the crowd. Even the stagehands, those who'd seen every type of emotional moment, stood still, some wiping their eyes behind their cameras. Elaine lifted the microphone gently from Steve's hand, her own trembling slightly. "Can I say something?" He nodded, stepping back with respect. She looked around the studio at the audience. The lights, the sea of faces watching her with quiet reverence. "My husband used to tell me," she began, "that sound is just memory wearing a voice. I never understood it until now. I thought when he died, his voice went with him. But today I learned love has its own frequency." Her daughter took her hand. "And it never stops broadcasting," she added. The audience gasped softly at that. A perfect line, simple and true. Steve smiled through his tears. "You see what I mean?" he said gently. "That right there is why we do this show. Because sometimes, when people come up here to play a game, what they're really doing is reminding the rest of us what matters." He took a breath, deep and trembling. "We spend so much time chasing after things that fade: money, fame, followers. But love, real love, it echoes forever. That man's voice is proof." The crowd applauded again, louder now, not as noise, but as gratitude. Steve looked back at Elaine and her daughter. "I think your husband just gave us all a sermon," he said softly. Elaine laughed through her tears. "He always did have the last word." The audience laughed with her, the kind of laughter that heals. Steve placed his hand over his heart. "Then I guess we better listen." The lights dimmed again, warm and soft, wrapping around them like a benediction. The cameras zoomed out, capturing the three of them standing together, the host, the widow, and her daughter in a pool of golden light. For a fleeting moment, it looked less like a show and more like a memory being written, one that would outlast the applause, the lights, and the walls of the studio itself. The air in the studio had turned to something weightless, a silence so deep it almost shimmered. The lights hung suspended like halos, soft gold pouring down over the stage where Elaine, her daughter, and Steve Harvey stood together. It was no longer a game show. It was something between a church and a living room, where grief and gratitude sat side by side and neither tried to outshine the other. Steve exhaled slowly, his voice quiet but clear. "You know, I think every now and then, God lets us borrow moments like this," he said. "Just to remind us that love doesn't disappear, it just changes how it speaks to us." The audience was utterly still. A few rows back, a man whispered to the woman beside him, "That's the truth right there." But even his voice cracked under the weight of it. Steve turned toward Elaine's daughter, the tape recorder still in her hands. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lydia," she said softly. "Lydia." he repeated, smiling gently. Your daddy's voice just went out across this whole world today. You realize that? People are gonna watch this and remember their own people, the ones they thought they'd lost. Her eyes filled again, but this time her tears came with a small, knowing smile. That's all he ever wanted, she said, to remind people that they're loved. Steve nodded, his deep brown eyes glistening. Then he's still doing his job. Lydia laughed softly, the sound breaking the stillness just enough to let the room breathe again. He'd be proud of that, she said. He used to say, if love don't echo past you, you ain't spoken loud enough. Steve's hand went to his chest. Lord have mercy, he whispered. That man had poetry in him. Elaine's face softened into a smile, tender, bittersweet. He used to write little sayings like that on napkins and stick them in my purse, she said. I'd find them days later, just when I needed them. It was like he knew the future before it happened. Steve shook his head gently, visibly moved. That right there, that's what real love looks like. It shows up before you even know you'll need it. The crowd murmured softly, absorbing the truth of it. Some reached for their partner's hands. Others simply let their tears fall in silence. Then, from the corner of the stage, the band's pianist, an older man with silver hair, began to play a few quiet notes. Just soft chords, nothing rehearsed, something that sounded like memory turned into music. It filled the room without intruding, like the faint hum of a lullaby you half remember from childhood. Steve turned his head slightly, listening. The moment breathed again. He looked back to Elaine. You hear that? She nodded, eyes closing. That's what his voice feels like now, she said. Music without words. Steve smiled faintly. That's beautiful. He looked around at the audience, then back to the mother and daughter. I think we all needed this today, he said. I think we needed to be reminded that the people we've lost didn't leave us empty. They left us echoes, laughter, love, memories, and that's enough to keep us standing. Elaine took a deep breath, wiping her cheeks. For a long time I thought I had to move on, she said. But I've learned I don't have to move on. I just have to move forward and take him with me. The crowd erupted into quiet applause, nodding, many mouthing amen. Steve stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder again. You just helped a lot of people with that, he said. Somebody watching this right now needed to hear that exact thing. He turned toward the camera, his expression solemn but full of warmth. Listen, he said, voice low, steady. When somebody you love passes on, don't you ever think you lost everything? You didn't. You still carry their best parts in how you laugh, in what you teach, in who you forgive. You're the living proof that they were here. The words landed heavy, beautiful. People in the audience nodded through tears. The pianist kept playing quietly in the background, letting the emotion breathe like a living thing. Steve took a deep breath. This show's been around a long time, he said softly. But every once in a while, we get a reminder that what we're really doing here isn't about questions or answers. It's about people, about the stories that keep this world human. He looked toward Elaine and Lydia again. And you two, y'all just reminded us what humanity looks like when it's at its best. Elaine smiled, holding the recorder gently. Then my David would say his job's done. Steve chuckled softly, wiping the corner of his eye. Nah, ma'am. I think his job's just beginning. Because that voice, that love, it's gonna keep echoing long after today. The lights dimmed again, the music slowing to a hush. The audience began to hum quietly, an instinctive murmur of shared emotion. Steve turned slightly toward them, his voice taking on that familiar mixture of preacher and poet. You can't script moments like this, he said. You can't plan them. They just happen. And when they do, all you can do is stop, feel it, and thank God you were there to see it. He looked around the room, the faces glowing in the soft light, every person united by a single story. Some of y'all walked in here today thinking you were just coming to watch a show, he said. But what you really walked into was proof that love never leaves the room. He let the silence hang, heavy and holy. Then, with a deep breath, he smiled at the two women again. Thank you for bringing your husband back to us today. For a few minutes, he spoke through all of us. And now, every heart in this room is carrying a piece of that love with them. Elaine nodded, clutching the recorder close. He always said love multiplies when you share it, she whispered. Steve tilted his head, eyes glistening. And it just did. The lights lifted to a soft golden hue again. The audience, moved beyond words, stood to their feet, not in applause this time, but in quiet reverence. Steve looked down, then lifted his face back to the camera, his final words measured and full of grace. "Sometimes," he said softly, "television doesn't just entertain, it heals." The pianist hit one last gentle note. The crowd exhaled as one. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and share so the world never forgets moments like these. This is Stories Left Behind, where human stories are never lost.